I'm going to call the Ways and Means Committee meeting to order.
If you push it too hard, it'll fall over.
Like that?
Yeah. I'll just keep my finger.
All right. I think I'm going to hopefully deal with an easy one first. We're going to call HB 766. This is Beth Beskin's bill. She's tied up in another committee. But what this bill is, it includes two bills that have both already passed full committee, but we brought them back from rules and combined them into one bill. They're ad valorem tax bill. One is Beth Beskin's definition of spouse for the purpose of homestead exemption, and the other is one that Chairman David Knight had, which dealt with the totally disabled veteran and the ad valorem tax homestead exemption for that one, both of which, like I said, have already passed full committee, but we came back, brought them back and combined them into one bill. So if there are any questions, Chairman Knight will be happy to answer them. If not, I'd be happy to entertain a motion. A motion do pass. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Lee Hawkins, come talk to us about ABLE.
Come up also, Mr. Chairman.
This is House Bill 768. It's LC 336510S.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think everyone knows about this bill, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. I know you got a lot of bills. This is a bill that is a 529 type bill. The federal government has been passing legislation on this. This bill encompasses and mirrors the federal legislation. This allows the disabled to save like a 529 savings account. The limitations are $14,000 a year asset limit, total life savings of $235,000. This will be for the folks that are disabled that want to work, get a job, and live independently. Right now they have a total asset limit of $2,000. It's not possible for them to do that. This bill has gone back to subcommittee 3 times. It has been thoroughly worked over, I think. It is a great bill now. Chairman Williamson has been very helpful in working with the wording here. And our state treasurer is going to speak to the bill. He is going to be the administrator of this bill. This is Steve McCoy.
Thank you, sir. This bill, the changes made will allow this bill will allow us to set up a program. The program the bill gives the flexibility to either for the state to establish a full-fledged its own program for Georgia residents only, or to join a consortium of other states. And there are a lot of states discussing this right now, and some have began the process of creating a consortium, contract with another state, or actually set up a site and provide information, education, and direct residents to other plans that are being operated by other states. The reason being is some states have been working on this for 1.5 to 2 years. They're much further along. It's uncertain right now what the costs are because none have been implemented. It appears that one state, Nebraska, is the closest, and that they maybe send an RFP the next month or so. So what this does is provide the flexibility for this board to decide what is the most cost-effective and program-effective method of actually providing these accounts for people who qualify, for the disabled that qualify, and that it'll give that ability to the board to determine that and to provide it in that manner.
Are there any questions?
Just a comment, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williamson.
Mr. McCoy, is it not true that you've helped numerous states on 529-like plans, consulted with them, helped them implement them?
Yes, sir. Actually, before I became treasurer, this is my second time as treasurer. I was treasurer in the 90s and left for a dozen years and then was invited back. That when I was gone, I actually set up 6 college savings plans for some other states, not for Georgia. I saw them from the creating a program and the difficulty to get them up and going. Did some of the actually one of the top plans in the nation is for Western State. So I did from the scratch, came back, and now I'm oversee the Georgia Path to College 529 plan. And so we've restructured it on the marketing and admin to make it more efficient as well.
And a follow-up question. Is it not true that this plan offers the most flexible options from the taxpayer's perspective and also for our beneficiary community, the group we're trying to help with this? In your opinion, yes or no?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you just got cross-examined. Any other questions? What's the pleasure of the committee?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Do pass. Is there any discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes on to rules. Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you.
Chairman Houston, we are looking at HB 763, it's LC 430293S. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I bring you committee substitute to 776. It's better known as the Food Bank Bill. This bill exempts sales and use tax from bulk food purchases from qualified food banks that buy this food for hunger relief. The second part exempts sale and use tax on food and food ingredients that are donated for hunger and disaster relief. Georgia food banks report the value of the donated foods to the Department of Human Resources. The department uses this donated amount as their third-party maintenance of efforts. And because of this donation, Georgia is able to recoup from TANF money an estimated $23 million a year. And there's a 5-year sunset on this. If I have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, or else we have Ms. Kraft is here with the Georgia Food Bank.
Are there questions? If there are no questions, I will entertain a motion. There's a motion and a second. Do pass. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes on the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Quick, we're going to hear HB 923. Do we have the substitute?
We do.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, may I bring Chief Stevens
You certainly may.
and his questions?
Is it 923 or 922?
923, Mr. Chairman, and the substitute is LC 344858S.
Wait a second. We need to make sure that we are voting on whatever we're voting on. Sir? Okay.
But it actually is, it's listed as HB 923.
All right, so let me see. We're operating off of LC 344858S.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
All right, present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ladies now and gentlemen of the committee. This is Chief Ben Stevens of the West Jackson Fire District with me here today, and this bill would recognize the independent governing status of fire districts who have elected governing bodies supported in whole or in part by ad valorem taxes. And so the West Jackson Fire District was created back when Representative Bubba McDonald held this, represented Jackson County. Actually, it was, I think, Chairman Benton's seat in 1965. The fire district was formed. The Constitution was amended, and they are a separate governing body, just as a school district is a separate governmental entity. When Chief Stevens came on board, as chief in 2007, he started trying to get some things in order, and at that time began working with the Department of Revenue to gain a sales tax exemption through the department, because they are a governing body independently. They have been unable to do that over this time frame, and the department believes that unless it is specifically designated in code that the exemption, they would not have the ability to administratively grant the exemption. So this change, what HB 923 would do is to recognize the independent governmental status of this independent fire district, and places in the code section along the lines of the United States government, states, counties, municipalities, and now fire districts with elected governing bodies that supported by ad valorem taxes. And so that, Mr. Chairman, is the bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Okay, Representative Carson.
Representative Quick, appreciate you bringing this forward. So I don't have a background in municipal or county government. Could you just tell me a fire district which has an elective governing body, is that, how many are there? Are we talking about just about every fire department in the state, or can you clarify that some more?
I'll try. We cannot locate definitively another independent fire district remaining in the state of Georgia. The chief put out a call to the state Fire Chiefs Association. We believe there was an independent district operating in Augusta prior to consolidation, and in Macon prior to the recent consolidation. And he's sort of on the trail of maybe two that might remain in Greene County, but that's unsubstantiated at this point. So we know of no other remaining independent operating fire district that operates as West Jackson does, independently in all respects from the Jackson County government.
If I may, Mr. Chairman. So I think if I may state this, the intent of this legislation is to put the West Jackson Fire Department on the same level playing field as other fire districts that do not have that do have a sales tax exemption. Is that correct?
Through the municipality or through the county, those departments would have an exemption for the equipment that they purchase. Yes, sir.
Right. And all other materials, correct?
Yes, sir.
Chairman Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the chief, is your police chief in support of this in Brazelton?
I would believe that he would be. He was a volunteer with us for over 30 years.
Tell Nana I said hello.
I will do that, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion. All right, there's a motion and a second. Do pass. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Passes 2 rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
members of the committee.
I'm going to ask Brett Harrell, Representative Harrell, to chair the meeting for the time being while I present a bill. We're going to present HB 893.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You can present from right where you are, I presume.
Well, thank you. This is House Bill 893. It is a Department of Revenue bill. 6 years ago, approximately, we changed the threshold by which people would have to electronically file and reduced it down to $1,000 for a period of time, and then reduced it after that to $500 to try to give people time to transition to the electronic age. And now, 6 years later, it's time to go through that process again. Almost everybody in the world is now in a position to file electronically, and it certainly saves the department quite a bit of money, and it, quite frankly, reduces some inefficiencies and errors, because if I file with a paper, then the department has to enter that into the system, and so there is the possibility of error, whereas if I file electronically, then they've got exactly what it is that I entered into the system. And that's basically what the bill does, and there is someone from the department here who can answer any questions, because I have told you everything I know.
I see no questions. Is there any question by any member of the committee? Larson.
Chairman Powell was just wondering, the 250 and the 100, is that per quarter, per year? I'm just not clear. Or is that in each individual return, so whatever period that return covers, I presume, right?
Yeah, it says with any return.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I appreciate the question. Rick Gardner, Deputy General Counsel with the Department of Revenue. It depends on the type of return, so it would be per return, so it's quarterly or what have you.
Any other questions of on the bill or from Revenue? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee?
Move to pass. Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Chairman Welch. All right, this is a constitutional amendment. It's H.R. 502. We're operating off of LC 344803S. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Thank you for the opportunity to present the bill to the committee. This is a constitutional resolution. It would require 2/3 majority vote in the House and Senate to be put on the ballot for November for the consideration by the voters. In summary, the bill allows, currently the Constitution prohibits the General Assembly from dedicating any fees except by an amendment to the Constitution. Over time, the people of the state of Georgia have amended the Constitution 15 or more times to allow for different constitutionally dedicated routes of fees or revenues that are brought into the state. This particular amendment would allow for the General Assembly to dedicate fees or taxes for their intended purposes, provided that the legislation in which it's presented specifies the purpose for which the fees or taxes are needed and for what purposes they're supposed to be applied to. Secondarily, that it has a sunset of no more than 10 years, so that the fee or tax would have to be reevaluated by the General Assembly. That the fee or tax also is going to be administered, that the bill specifies a specific agency who is to administer the money. And in order for that bill to pass and to be a dedicated fee, would still require a 2/3 majority of both chambers. But the difference is that rather than submitting it back to the voters for a constitutional amendment and thus rewriting the Constitution and adding that language to the Constitution, the legislation itself would become a dedicated fee pursuant to this new constitutional provision. This allows the General Assembly to dedicate fees and taxes as it sees fit in a format that would be outside of the appropriation process. There is a safety valve built into this legislation, and that is so that obviously requiring supermajorities in both chambers is an elevated standard that is unusual for most of our legislation, and that thereby making it more difficult to dedicate fees in an irrational manner. Secondarily, with a sunset provision built in that's mandated by this constitutional amendment that every such bill would have to have in it, that would require us to reconsider on a periodic basis whether we still want those fees or revenues dedicated. There is, during times of economic difficulty, as we experienced in the Great Recession, this The constitutional amendment also provides that the General Assembly, by majority vote in both chambers, can suspend the dedication of the fee or revenue for up to 4 years, but not to exceed a total of 4 years within a 10-year period. So for 60% of the time, it's guaranteed that that money will be allocated and used for the dedicated purpose in which it's intended. But there could be situations in which we need that relief in order to not lay off teachers, or to go back into furlough days, or to adversely affect state employees because of an economic downturn. Those fees could be used in the manner in which sometimes they are used now. That is the heart, and that is the summary of the bill. I would like to point out to the committee just a few examples of why this is probably, I think, needed. First off, let's just take, for example, the fees that we've collected in the past for the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund. For example, there are 64 abandoned hazardous sites with an estimated cleanup of those sites of about $57 million. Over the time of the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, there has been a collection of upwards of $13 million just in 2015, and an appropriation of $4 million. So $13.4 million collected in 2015 and $4 million appropriated. In going back to 1994, the year after it was implemented, collections were $10 million, $10.1 million, and appropriations was $4.3 million. So you can see there's a significant disconnect between the amount collected and the amount appropriated, and this has historically been the case. If this were to be dedicated fees under the proposed constitutional amendment, then all those revenues would go to their intended purposes to help clean up these hazardous sites. The same would be true for your tire fees that we have discussed since I've been in the General Assembly for 6 years. That issue has come up many times. And also taking a look at Joshua's Law. For example, in Joshua's Law, enacted back in 2005, we've collected $87.4 million, but we've only appropriated $16.3. So this constitutional amendment would allow us what we cannot do now. So understand now that our hands are tied. We cannot constitutionally dedicate any fees or revenues for their intended purposes. Only the people of Georgia, through a constitutional amendment, can do that. This would actually give the General Assembly the constitutional flexibility to so do what many folks in Georgia have been asking us to do. And also think about it this way. Right now, your two options: general appropriations or an amendment to the Constitution, which the General Assembly cannot change except by going back to the people and asking them to either repeal that particular dedication or amend that dedication. So you have two extremes in how we operate fiscally, and our hands are tied in both ways. This would actually be the middle ground to provide some flexibility for dedication of fees. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to take questions.
You have a couple. Chairman Rice.
Thank you, Chairman Welsh. Appreciate you bringing the bill. Since I have done exactly this in terms of trying to get some fees handled through this process. Let me make sure I understand this in terms. This is fees. It says fees and taxes.
Yes. Well, some of our taxes are considered excise taxes, and so they would fit into the definition of an excise tax, such as the dollar may be considered an excise tax. We even had this come up with the fuel taxes coming up with the last year's legislation. There are some revenues that we bring in that would be more considered a tax, and if we wanted to dedicate that particular tax, we would need the constitutional language to do so. So that's why I've included both fees and taxes.
So you don't think this would lead to an opportunity by 2/3 vote, right?
Correct.
For any kind of tax, sales tax, income tax, or any of those taxes,
it could
to be dedicated to some particular interest of 2/3 of the body?
It certainly could. The language is built so that it could do that. The check on that is the requirement that the legislation that is dedicating the fee or the tax have a sunset of no longer than 10 years. So that would require us to revisit this because it would automatically terminate. That particular tax would automatically terminate. So if you put it on a sales tax or you put it on an income tax, then what would happen is that legislation would have to have an automatic termination of no greater than 10 years for it to repeal on its own. Naturally, the General Assembly can revoke or repeal that, again, by 2/3 majority.
Follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. I see the 10-year horizon on line 38. I'm looking for, and that has to do with the financial emergency provision. I'm looking for it in the rest of the bill.
Look at lines 16. If you'll read there, it should say.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Representative Will.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Duncan. Is that your? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Mosby.
Oh, okay. I defer to Jeff now. If you. All right. Two questions. One, transportation projects could take longer than 10 years. So, like 400, building 400. It seems to me that you can get in the middle of a project, and that General Assembly 10 years from now might be not as interested in continuing to move that forward. So you have bonds sitting out there. So wouldn't this cause some sort of confusion in this process?
Well, I don't think it would, but it's a good question because you're right. You may have projects that have longer lifespans than whatever revenue you dedicated. But I think that also works as an inherent check on the process because knowing that constitutionally you can't dedicate the fee longer than a 10-year horizon would constrain what fees and what projects you're going to include in such a dedication bill. So I think this body has been prudent in how it allocates and also placing sunsets on legislation. And when it does that, certainly a department such as the Department of Transportation would run the risk if they chose to allocate that fee to a project that extended beyond 10 years. They would certainly run the risk that they would no longer have that revenue dedicated going forward and would have to go through the general appropriation process to regain some of that revenue, if any. But that's an inherent check on the use of this.
But wouldn't it affect the pricing of the bonds to do that project, though?
If the bonds were beyond the projection of the tax period, it certainly could, and that's why the agency should use prudence in what it uses those dedicated funds or fees for, and so they would have to exercise their discretion, but it would have to be one in which, frankly, they used caution.
Okay, one final question, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Chairman England knows about this? No,
he does.
He's not happy with it, but he knows about it.
That's true.
But I remind him periodically that the fee bill that we passed almost unanimously out of this House several years ago, that he was one of the signers of that. Okay. Representative Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Probably a follow-up or a lead off of what Representative just spoke about. It would be up to the General Assembly to then elect that. So looking forward and things like that, excess of 10 years, you would probably not put that under this provision, because I see in here that you would have to, any law, in fact, currently we would have to go back on the tires and the environmental, the dumping, all of that. We would have to go back and if this were to pass, enact new legislation that specifically tied back into this constitutional amendment should it pass.
That's 100% correct. So with whatever legislation we're considering, so if we wanted to place Joshua's Law into this dedicated and utilize this new constitutional amendment should it pass, we would have to go back and re-adopt Joshua's Law, for example, with meeting these constitutional requirements should they become effective. So that's exactly correct. So any of these things would just be prospective in its application.
Okay.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me apologize to Chairman Welch and the chair and the rest of the members. I was Googling Joshua's Law over here to look at the expenditures when I inadvertently pressed, my fingers are bigger than the link was, and got some unwanted music into the room. Hope it made everybody's afternoon. No, I thank Chairman Welch for bringing this. We've talked before. I had a similar resolution or similar mindset. Just a couple of things, if I might ask, that we have talked about that in answering the questions, perhaps you'd share your thoughts with the committee. You don't see this as a place where somebody is going to go reauthorize 2% of the income tax and try to grab it under this for a 10-year period and do something with it. That's not really your intent. And in fact, would it not be pretty hard to get done?
That is not my intention, and it would be difficult. That's why you have an elevated threshold of 2/3, so that the collective wisdom of the body in both bodies would be required in order to do that. And furthermore, the governor has to sign it because it's a bill. This resolution does not, but ultimately the bill could be vetoed by the governor.
So, and again, following up on that, and the thing that is near and dear to my heart, having talked with Mr. Brown a great deal in the off session, is, and I won't repeat your numbers, but we have collected multi-millions of dollars for driver's ed, and we have not spent that in that manner. Would this bill also, and I think I know the answer to the question, but please let the committee know, this doesn't mean if you collect $15 million for Joshua's Law in fiscal year 17 that we have to, by George, spend that money in 17. This bill would give them the latitude to carry that money over, or this resolution would give them the latitude to carry that money over. So it's not a requirement to spend it, but it would keep it locked away only for use as constitutionally dedicated. Correct?
It does not mandate the application of the revenues in any particular fiscal year. The constitutional amendment does. Now, certainly the bill, the legislation might do that, but then that would be the deliberation of the body as to how that money was to be dedicated, and that's why. And actually, Chairman Powell and Chairman Martin are individuals who spoke to me about having some more tightness, if you will, to the original bill, and it's from those discussions that we've added this sunset provision and been more expressed in how this is to be dedicated.
I guess I compliment you in the form of a question, and I'll compliment you on doing just that and not getting us, Chairman Powell, into that situation that existed a few years ago with the funds for the public defender, where they would come in and ask for the amount of money that happened to be raised by their fees that year and the carryover. This bill is well, or this resolution is well crafted, giving the legislature the ability to bring forth with 2/3 majority and do what we said we were going to do with things like Joshua's Law and the Waste Management Fund. And I think, is it not true that the amounts of money you're talking about would be minuscule in comparison to the $22 billion budget? You're talking about 10 or 12 million a year that we as a legislature said we were collecting for this purpose, that you just want to see us have the opportunity to spend for that purpose.
I think the number would be closer to 25 million.
I meant for each fund,
for those
fund,
three,
for the together.
If you did those
right,
three
together, would be 25 to 30, right?
Yes, sir. But no, that is the expressed intent. That is the intent of this legislation. That's expressed intent from the very first sentence is to authorize the General Assembly to dedicate fees and taxes following this particular process, and that to me is good government. It reassures the public that when we are asking them for this particular add-on, we're asking them for this particular tax, then we're going to put it for that purpose. We do this with local governments and their SPLOST projects. We say put the list together. You can only use the money for that list. This is consistent with that good government process, and I just would remind us that without this flexibility in our Constitution, we are in the habit of dedicating substantial, large sums of money in the Brain Trust Fund and the Children's State Trust Fund, and this money is just dedicated to trust funds, and it sits there. And whether it's used or isn't used or how it's appropriated, there is no, there's no oversight from us in regard to that, because the only way to do anything about undoing the trust fund is to repeal it by constitutional amendment. So you lock your hands legislatively in a broader sense of appropriations. You lock your hands more tightly, more handcuffed, if you will, in a constitutional amendment than with what's proposed in H.R. 502.
Is it Representative Buckner? Is that your light? Okay.
This concept is interesting to me because I've had a lot of frustration over the trust funds not being able to be used for the things that we were put trust in the state for them to be used for. But I also have a concern with the proposal, and my concern is that if we get a large percentage of funds that are dedicated in this manner, then that leaves us could leave us in an awkward position to carry on the rest of the business of the state. What are the safeguards to prevent that from happening?
That's a very good question. The safeguards are twofold. One is that any measure that's adopted as a dedicated revenue stream under this proposal can also be repealed by 2/3 in both chambers. So if there becomes a financial emergency, 2/3 of the two chambers can repeal the revenue stream or repeal its dedication under this particular measure. So it would be an amendment to the bill, but it would require 2/3 vote to amend it. The other is built into this is the release valve of if the governor declares a state of financial emergency for the state by majority in the House and in the Senate, and it's just the adoption of a resolution, you may suspend, both chambers by adopting that may suspend the dedication of the fees for no more than 4 years during a 10-year period. So we've built in some relief in that sense, so that it's the 2/3 majority vote is not required in the state of an economic emergency whereby we need those revenues to offset some other emergency need for the state.
May I follow up? Both of those scenarios you mentioned that I thought maybe I heard you wrong, but one, the governor had to declare an emergency and then it would take a majority of the vote.
That's
and then you said that, did you say with or without an emergency it could change with 2/3?
Without an emergency,
Okay.
then it could be amended with 2/3 majority in both chambers.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Teasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Welch, would you speak to, I appreciate that concern, but in a society where everything is online, everything is searchable, we have a society that is increasingly looking for transparency, is it your view that the gain we take on here in terms of added transparency outweighs the concern of binding a future legislature's hands in terms of how things are allocated?
I think that there would be enhanced transparency in two ways. One, you'd have more transparency in that we are stating in the legislation, if we were to readopt Joshua's law, for example, and place it under this dedication, we are now being more transparent in the sense that that money now, whatever the revenues are, less administrative costs, because that's included in your resolution that's allowed for, would then be applied to this intended purpose. So you'd have transparency in that dedication of the money. Secondarily, you'd have transparency in that the public as a whole would be able to obviously review that, and if the public or us as duly elected representatives of the public sought fit to change that for whatever reason, then we have a mechanism by doing that. We currently do not have that mechanism except by amendment of the Constitution by the people to make any change. And out of that, we've had I think it's 17 proposed amendments, the exact number here, and out of all the proposed amendments for dedicated fees, all of them have passed but 3. So, once you start talking about it and you talk about the public's desire to have funds dedicated for the intended purposes, they generally want that. And they want it at a clip of about 73% of the time. And so it's very seldom that it's not that way. And the only way to undo that is, again, to pass it by 2/3 majority, repeal it, and put it to the voters to ask them to repeal that dedicated trust fund. I would imagine, it hasn't been tried, at least not that I'm aware of, I would imagine that would be difficult to do.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing this bill.
Representative Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Welch, I think, as well as many of the other members, this is a good idea. But I want to go back to Representative Mosby's question with regard to longer-term projects.
Yes.
So if a county or a region or the state wanted to dedicate funds for, say, a transportation or transit project that was long-term, say, MARTA, how would you envision something like that being implemented with this in place?
It could be implemented. It would just be on a no longer than 10-year basis. So the project would have to be planned out, executed, and funded within that time frame of 10 years.
So,
and if you think about it, the TIA measure that this body, and I think some members here voted for several years ago, also had a 10-year window. The projects that were contemplated under that measure was a maximum of 10 years for the dedication of that revenue. So this tracks previous legislative decisions by both bodies, House and Senate, and I think in a bipartisan form, to enact legislation that had a maximum 10-year window.
Well, further question. Yes, you're absolutely right. It did track with the TIA and some other things that we've done, but would not have tracked with MARTA, which was funded, has dedicated funding for a much longer period of time.
Yes, that's true. So if you, with respect to that, you wouldn't want to take the current pennies that are being dedicated for MARTA's purposes, you wouldn't want to put them under this particular provision. That's
my question. How would something like that be enacted if this provision was in place? How could we move forward on a? Would you envision having a different constitutional amendment that would then be for a period longer than 10 years, a separate spending provision that would allow for a longer term that would be separate and apart from H.R. 502? Would that be allowed?
I would not. You ask me more of a personal question. I would not. But on this measure, it would allow for enormous flexibility that we just currently don't have, and it would still allow for the use of transportation revenues if they were so dedicated, but only for that 10-year window.
So again, I believe that this is a good idea, except for those scenarios where there is a much longer term project that requires more than a 10-year commitment from a governing body to ensure that the funding was there for 10, 15, 20 years or longer. Is there a way outside of this provision for a measure like that to be enacted?
Yes, you could dedicate it by virtue of the Constitution. The current provision is a dedication that's 2/3 majority in both chambers, and then that then it would have to go to the voters for their approval.
Okay. But just to clarify, a governing body could enact a constitutional amendment that is separate and distinct from this one that would allow them to enact a tax or fee collection that would be in excess of 10 years.
Under our present Constitution.
No. If this passes.
No, if this passes, it would not alter that at all. If this passes, any bill that seeks to dedicate a revenue stream of fees or taxes would have to have a built-in expiration of 10 years. So to do it beyond the 10 years, one of two things would need to happen. This legislation would not need to include a 10-year sunset or a longer sunset, or you could utilize the existing constitutional provision that says that the General Assembly by 2/3 majority and approval by the governor, 2/3 majority without the approval of the governor, that would be a resolution that goes before the people for voting on that particular amendment, and that would be a physical amendment to the Constitution for a particular thing, like the spinal trust.
Thank you.
Everybody in order, I think. I think I've got everybody in order. Next, we have number 17, I think. Is that all right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to contemplate the implications of this. And you mentioned Joshua's Law a couple of different times. You also mentioned that this was requested by a number of people, or you indicated that there was public support for this on a general basis. Somehow, I think I caught those words. If you didn't say that, then tell me.
No, I didn't.
You didn't say that? I thought you had indicated. Yeah, I thought you said there was broad support at one time or another.
Well, what I'm saying is that what I was saying was that through my tenure here, I think I was talking about my tenure here. We've had We've had a measure that Chairman Powell actually sponsored, and I helped amend to a particular legislation. I think it was the Solid Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, to roll back the fee itself if it wasn't being utilized for its appropriated purpose. I think there was a signing measure that went with the governor on that.
Yeah, I think that maybe goes to what I was talking about here, because the Joshua's Law, the way that worked was to put a fee on every one of the traffic offenses in the state. Right, and it generated a lot of money, as they all do, effectively. Yes. But the administration of Joshua's Law was left up to the committee, as the driver services committee, driver education committee, as part of driver services, and the fund was actually administered by GOHS, and it was done on a grant basis. But even in that situation, the requests from the people, basically school districts, really didn't match the level of funding that they had for that particular situation. So the potential in some of these things, to me, is to have these funds lay over for a long period of time. And I just think there's got to be some way that the governor has and the Appropriations Committee has the opportunity to reallocate on a more favorable time frame than what may be indicated in the bill.
Well, and I think that it allows for that in this resolution, because what you would do is, as a period of time goes by, and let's say that folks are not asking for the grant money, in Joshua's Law's example, if school districts are not asking for the money, then there's really two things we ought to be doing and considering, I think, as a General Assembly. Under this measure, you would look to either amend the bill to reduce the fee, or you would eliminate the fee altogether by a vote of 2/3 in both chambers. In the current situation, perhaps we ought to be looking at whether or not we should be collecting that much of a fee to begin with. So what it does is it forces us to be very, very considerate about how much of a fee we're asking for, and for those dedicated purposes, and then it behooves us to track that over time to make sure that it is being utilized in a fashion that was intended. If it's not, take it away. Get it off the books and free up the taxpayers' wallets. So I think it's favorable in that it has a higher degree of accountability for us as a General Assembly with respect to these fees and taxes that we're telling this folks this is what we're going to use it for.
Follow up. That may be true. As I remember the passage of Joshua's Law, a lot of that had to do with the emotion of the moment. And that motivation would carry the day on any kind of a fee at that particular point in time. We've seen it over and over, I think, in these situations. The only other question I had for you is, how do other states handle this?
I haven't looked at other states' constitutions to determine how they have it. I understand that Alabama has there are states that have done over-dedicated revenues, and so and I think historically, going back and looking at the Georgia Constitution, before the 1983 Constitution was adopted, I believe that there was also a problem of where we were dedicating revenues and creating hamstringing the appropriations process. So I think that there is reason, sound reason, in terms of the administration of government, that the hands of appropriations are not overly constrained, especially in times where you have shortfalls in your revenues. So I'm not being dismissive of that very practical concern at all, and that's why I've tried to craft this legislation not as a one-size-fits-all situation, but as a compromise position between the two extremes. And that's why it has the relief valves that are built into it. That's why it's still subject to the governor's execution, because he could veto the measure. And that's why it's also amendable. So in all those respects, I've tried to contemplate the situations where you don't get overly excited about dedicating fees, but you also have the opportunity to do so, and do so in a prudent manner.
Just sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. Turn me off. A lot of people do
We
that.
have 4 or 5. We have 4 or 5 others blinking.
Yeah, I got it.
We can be as brief as
Just
we can.
remind me of what happens to the lapse fees. How do you handle? How do you handle getting those lapse fees back?
The lapse fees are not spoken of in here.
Okay.
So, but what the language of the constitutional amendment merely says that it's not subject to appropriations.
Okay.
And Rick, I see Rick behind you. So in case I've
look at line 20.
Line 20. Okay, here we go.
19, actually.
Sorry, 19. Any general law enacted pursuant shall not be subject to limitations of Article 3, Section 9, subparagraph 4C relating to the lapsing of funds. All right, so Rick, tell me now if I'm...
So what that means is generally through the appropriations process, if funds are not expended, they lapse in the sense they revert to the general fund. These fees that we are saying we can dedicate would not be subject to that. They would stay
in trust.
In trust where they were dedicated. They would not lapse back to the general fund.
Right. So if you take, for example, a hazardous waste fund, and you have an accumulation of revenues there, which are quite substantial, $14 to $15 million a year. When you have that revenue that's there, and the projects are coming in, but obviously the projects are not executed in a manner in which they are completed and fully expended within that period of time. Each year, they're going to take multiple years to complete. By avoiding the lapsing and not reverting to the General Assembly, that reserve stays there so that EPD can execute on that and fulfill the obligations of the cleanup that's necessary, or the cleanup of tires. So that, I think, works to the benefit of what the purpose is. And so I appreciate Rick just clarifying that issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the questions.
All right, thank you. Chairman Martin, you're 28, right?
Yes, I am. I think, again, Chairman Welch, if the chair would give me a little latitude here, because I've worked with Chairman Welch on this. Rick and I worked on some of this in the summer. We would have had competing amendments, but I like Chairman Welch's, and he's moving forward as long as it gets done. To Representative Flood, I think when you're talking about bonding, we don't have to worry about bonding in the state and using this. We have the full taxing power of the state. We bond all the time without dedicating any funds because we constitutionally have to pay our bills. So if we want to bond a project, we can bond it irregardless of the gentleman's measure here today. I think what we're after here is making sure we do for Georgians what we tell them we're going to do. When we did Joshua's Law, we said we were taking those fees and we were going to take them and train people and drivers ed. And folks, we didn't do it like we should have. Maybe there wasn't Chairman Rice people at the time that wanted the money to do it, but we should have had something in place that said if there wasn't, we quit charging that money. Because there's about $80 million that we took saying we were going to do something that we didn't do that with it. It's just sitting in the general fund, and who knows how we're going to budget in next year's budget. So I would say this to the gentleman's constitutional amendment. What if this, were to have, his amendment passes, and in general law, if I were to come back with Joshua's Law and I would put something on the books that said these fees go in place, these funds go in this lockbox, and it's such times as those fees reach this amount, those fees will decrease. And when that fees go down below that such amount, the fees will go up. You basically create a sinking fund that goes into a lockbox so the people of Georgia know that when we put that fee in place, it goes for what we're going to do with it that which we said we were. And all Chairman Welch is doing is giving us the opportunity to set forth something with a supermajority in both houses and a governor's signature, quality implementing legislation to do with what we said. We can kind of talk around about a lot of things, but without this constitutional amendment, we have proven that we can't take the money from the fees that we generate and put it where it's supposed to be. And the gentleman's just trying to give us the opportunity to put before the voters a chance to take those monies and do that. And then it's incumbent upon us to bring forward the implementing underlying legislation to do the right thing. I think he's got a good, simple proposition, and we're making it much more complicated than it needs to be.
Mr. Mosby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Martin, for that. That was outstanding. It was tough to hear conservatives not being able to control themselves in the but okay.
Thank you for that comment. Your microphone is off.
But isn't this a shall or may issue? I mean, if we draft a bill and it shall be used for that, it should. That's it. If we on the Trauma Commission, the language says may. So I understand that if they get to a point when they want to use those monies for something else, that happens. But if it shall, those monies actually go to that purpose, and it has to. Right now, our flexibility today is a lot broader or greater today than it would be under this. So we have the ability to actually appropriate the dollars that we receive for the funding amounts that are there. So in the case of Joshua's law, since we keep bringing that up, if it collected $80 million and there were only $20 million worth of program dollars that it needed, then the General Assembly has the ability to put the $20 million in those programs and then use the other $60 million for whatever it wants to use it for. I assume that that's what's happening currently with the process. However, we have the ability as the legislative process to control those of us who have control over themselves in spending. Yeah. To be able to use the monies that were appropriated for the reason why they were collected for. So I'm just trying to understand, do we really need this?
Representative Mosby, I think that there's a couple of things in your statement. First off, you're talking about trauma and you're talking about the may. Mm-hmm. And right there in that very sentence, what I hear is, we're going to spend this money on trauma, but if may not.
Correct.
And that's exactly what we're trying to stop. The may in that statement is disingenuous to the people if you represent that we're asking for this revenue for trauma. And if you're not actually using it for trauma, then I don't think we've represented to the public what the true intentions were of the General Assembly, and we're not applying it where we told the public we would put it. So, and let's think about it just big picture. In appropriations, we have, in revenue and appropriations, we really have two concepts that work in Georgia. One is we pass a measure that levies a new fee, tax, or other assessment. And in that money constitutionally goes in the general fund, period. The only way you have dedicated revenues under our Constitution is if the people approve an amendment to the Constitution which specifies that this is going to be used for spinal injuries, for example. So those are our two mechanisms: general appropriations after we've levied a revenue bill, and dedicated by Constitution, which cannot be untied except by the people after it goes back to them for a vote. This measure would allow for a more centrist view, a more flexible view of how we can appropriate by giving the General Assembly the authority to dedicate revenues for trauma, and it shall be for trauma until the General Assembly votes by 2/3 majority to reverse that or amend that, or if we had a financial emergency. But this would give you the middle ground, and right now you have no middle ground. And so if you want greater appropriations flexibility in the big picture of things, then this measure is right up your alley. If you don't, if you want to be handcuffed, stick with what we've got. And if you want to go with general appropriations and be subject to that and not always giving the money where we said it was going to go, then just stay where we are. But if we want to have greater appropriation flexibility, I think this measure works in that middle ground.
So you're telling me you don't trust the appropriations process to do? I'm just trying. I'm trying to understand why we're here.
No, sir.
On this,
No, sir. I do trust it. The problem is that the measures that are often adopted use the language you just used, which is may.
All right, we're going to move on. Thank you, Mr. Mosby. We have 3 lights blinking. We're going to go to a member that has not asked a question yet. Chairman Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just don't see, if we're not going to use these fees as they were designated to use, is there any mechanism, this will give us a mechanism to take them off the books, right?
Yeah, oh, sure. You could take them off the books.
Well, this currently, would we have to go back and how do you remove a constitutional amendment?
That's a great question. And the only way to remove, let's say we wanted to remove for some reason
Joshua's Law, because we're not using it like we said, and it's not right for people to keep on paying money.
Joshua's not dedicated.
It's not a dedicated one.
But let's say we wanted the brain and spinal trust fund.
No, I don't want to do that.
I know, but I don't either. But just hypothetically, if you did, the only way to do that is by 2/3 in both houses. Then it goes to the people, and the people have to vote by majority to repeal it, or to unlock that trust, essentially, to undo the trust fund. And so to me, that's very difficult and not likely to happen. But under this measure, you'd actually have more flexibility.
Well, I think under this measure, I could probably vote for another fee, but unless we did a constitutional amendment, I don't think I'll ever be able to vote for another fee on anything because of the way the money's been used.
And I appreciate Representative Mosby's.
Sir?
I appreciate Representative Mosby's rhetoric and line of questioning, but let's be clear. In 1993, the Republicans weren't appropriating money, and so many of the measures that you're talking about, and the measures that the General Assembly has represented to the public, that they're going to clean up solid waste facilities and they're going to clean up tires, those things were enacted long before I was here. I was in college, and so what I'm saying is that I'm not trying to point political fingers, and I don't think that's where we need to go. I'm trying to build a consensus around 2/3. I need your vote. I need Mr. Flood's vote. I need Chairman Rice's vote. I got a lot of votes to get together here. So I don't think it's helpful to create the divide when what I'm trying to do is build a bridge here where we can have consensus around a tool that we don't have, that we really could use to help clean up some environmental issues in the state, that we could use to help protect drivers on the road and educate kids better on how to drive. I think there's consensus in this measure, and I hope we would build that consensus and not pull us apart.
Thank you. Chairman Knight.
I'd like to make a motion.
If you hold 1 second, Chairman Stevens, you waive, or do you have a question? All right, so we'll let you hold on 1 second.
I just
Mr. Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and perhaps you can provide some more background on the rationale for 10 years. How did you arrive at the 10 years? And why that's significant?
The 10 years was consistent with with several of the other measures we've had, which we've repealed. For example, we put a 10-year sunset on the Delta Airlines fuel tax. We put a 10-year sunset on a variety of bills, and also the TIA bill was one that had the 10-year limitation on it. So I felt like that was an outside window, that was a permissive amount of time, or a reasonable amount of time to place in terms of a sunset, allowing for projects to move forward within that 10 years, but also being close enough in time that it forces the General Assembly to reevaluate, going along with what Chairman Price was saying, where you have a buildup of funds and you haven't utilized them, to reevaluate both the need for the particular fee or revenue that you've implemented, as well as reevaluate whether or not that fee is too high, maybe too low. And so by having that sunset, I think that was a reasonable number. This committee could always consider another number, but I thought 10 years was consistent with previous legislative enactments.
Thank you.
Chairman Knight, I'll recognize you for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we do pass House Resolution 502.
We have a motion and a second to do pass. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
The ayes have it. The motion passes. Thank you, Chairman Welch.
Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you for your questions. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to House Bill 939, authored by Representative Price. This is LC 410689. If I can get the podium mic to come on. Say hello. That's working.
Looks good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The bill is House Bill 939 for your consideration. It's sort of a piggyback on a bill that was considered and passed in 2014, which was House Bill 1000, which authorized the courts to intercept tax refunds to satisfy unpaid fines and fees greater than $25. Pursuant to this bill, the Judicial Council Administrative Office of the Courts is to aggregate court requests and manage the intercept process with the Department of Revenue. A limited pilot program is in place and has started with this tax season. The program provides due process by the debtor by requiring the court to notify the debtor of the unpaid fine and fee and provide for a 30-day time period to reconcile the debt. If the debt remains unsatisfied, at the end of 30 days, the court will submit for a tax intercept. The Department of Revenue will notify the debtor of the impending tax intercept, who then has 30 days to contest. In the event the debt is challenged, the set-off is delayed until the validity of the debt is determined by a hearing officer. So in this year, 2016, legislation is sought to make some amendments to the current statute that was passed 2 years ago to enhance the efficiency of the process. The proposed legislation is threefold. One, it cleans up some language in the code, some minor typos. Number two, it permits the AOC to transfer the intercepted tax refund amount to the court to which the debt is owed prior to final determination, adding the courts as a fiduciary of funds pending appeals in addition to the AOC. And three, upon final determination of the tax set-off, the court to whom the debt is owed will notify the debtor in writing of the finalization of the set-off as currently done by the AOC. So overall, it's a more streamlined process to transfer intercepted funds to the court for satisfaction of the debt and does not affect the rights of the debtor. Final accounting notifications are better suited to come directly from the court where detailed case records are located. And would you like me to go through line by line, or?
No, ma'am, we certainly would not. Do members of the committee have any questions of the author with regard to this measure? I have a motion to pass. Is there a second? Second. There's a second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Thank you very much.
Representative Price. All right, we're going to move on to House Bill 922, authored by Representative Bruce Williamson. Representative Williamson, and your number? 19.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring to you for your consideration today committee substitute to House Bill 922. It's just been passed out. It should be in paper form in front of you. Laura, we didn't get that on the iPads. Okay. All right, so you've got it on the iPads as well. LC 344857S. This bill is brought to us by friends in the business community that realized there was sort of a glitch in our high-quality job tax credit program, or at least the administration of it. It comes with the implicit blessing of the Department of Revenue. They don't have any objection to it. And what we're dealing with is, under the current high-quality jobs tax credit program, there is a provision that every business entity grow 50 or more jobs what's transpired is that there are controlling businesses that use subsidiaries of principally LLCs that are sole member LLCs that are for tax purposes or disregarded entities. All the taxes are paid at the parent company level. The only reason these disregarded entities are being used are for encapsulating liability or similar business reasons. This frankly standard in standard business practices. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we're fulfilling our desire to attract high-quality paying jobs and not penalizing companies that choose to use perfectly legitimate business entities as part of their corporate structure. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear. Be happy to answer any questions.
Members of the committee have questions of the author? All right. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to point out to the committee that you need to look at the version that's on your desk in the paper form. The one that's on the iPad is an earlier version, but the only difference is the language that Representative Williamson just explained is exactly the same. The only difference is in the sub we've got an effective date and an application to it. So the explanation was fine with you. If you want to look at the bill, it's the paper.
And the paper version again, correct me, it's LC 344857S.
That is the LC number, correct. Paper version.
It just has an effective date.
It's just a date change. That's it. Yeah.
Chairman Rice, is that you, 17?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the author, I just wanted to know what a disregarded entity is on line 10.
Right. So, Mr. Chairman, that's accounting or IRS terminology that it's when you have a sole member LLC in particular. Those taxes, there's not even a K-1. The taxes are paid at the sole member's tax return level. So even though this LLC has its own tax identification number, all of the accounting and tax liability rolls up to the parent parent company. In this case, you might have a C corporation that is in fact the sole member of various LLCs. Again, those are just limited liability silos, if you will.
So the LLCs would be the disregarded entities?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Thank you.
Chairman Martin.
Chairman Wilson, so what I'm hearing there is if we have the unintended consequence without this piece of legislation that if a corporation in Georgia had multiple LLCs that together would qualify for the jobs tax credit, they would not, without this legislation, otherwise be able to get it, even though they were doing exactly what we asked them to do in creating the jobs.
That is correct, Chairman Martin. It's a 50-job trigger. And, for example, just as you just pointed out, you could have 5 LLCs with
10
30 or 10 or say 30 jobs, and because of the strict wording in the current code, even though all of the taxes are being paid at the parent company level, they wouldn't be eligible absent this clarifying piece of legislation.
And many times it means people set up that because they may set up each individual restaurant as a separate LLC for a variety of reasons relative to rent or employment or whatever, but this is just allowing them to get the same tax treatment that other corporations and individuals are getting.
So your concept is correct as far as the structure. Your example of restaurants might not be applicable because this is high quality job tax credit program. This more often than not targeted toward the high tech world. It could be high tech technology or healthcare. Typically higher paying jobs.
No, I didn't mean to take us off the field. I just meant, so in that case, it could be 4 or 5.
You described is correct.
Yeah, LLCs that might be different, creating different games for Chairman Dudgeon's company and the like.
That is correct.
Representative Carson.
Yeah, at the appropriate time, I'd like to make a motion.
This would be the time.
I'll move to pass.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. I'd just like to announce we are going to postpone hold House Bill 471 until our next hearing. There are two final bills, House Bill 936 and 937, that I authored, and Chairman Knight is going to chair the remainder of the meeting as I present those two bills. All right, we'll do that then.
All right, Chairman Harrell, if you will proceed with the presentation of your bill. What bill number is that?
936.
HB 936. We're working from LC 34476ER.
Thank you, sir. House Bill 936 simply clarifies some language with regard to our opportunity zones. It makes clear that the new jobs created, each new job has to be at or above the average wage rather than the average of all jobs being created at that established wage. And it also indicates a definition of that new job being a newly created position that was not previously located in the state, has a minimum number of 35 hours a week. With that, to take any questions with regard to House Bill 936.
Members of the committee.
Second.
We've got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those like sign. It does pass. Next bill.
937.
HB 937, working from LC 3447797ER.
And House Bill 937 simply extends by 3 years the sunset provision for sales and use tax exemption on our projects of regional significance. These are large competitive projects that average over 1,800 jobs in the state and $650 million in capital investment. And it extends the sunset from June 30, 2016 to June 30, 2019. That is the only change.
Got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed like sign. And the bill passes.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
So here.